start talking.
Okay, I will. I'm going to click the Start Webinar button. Oops. There we go. Alrighty. You can go when you're ready.
Okay, good. So welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Laura Miller. I'm the Shibusawa Seigo Arai Endowed Professor of Japanese Studies and Professor of History at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So welcome to our first webinar of the academic year. And we will have a co-organizer, Dr. Rebecca Copeland, who will lead the question and answer period. Dr. Copeland is a professor of Japanese language and literature at Washington University in St. Louis, and she's the author of numerous groundbreaking books, and more recently, an award-winning work of fiction. So for the Q&A, please use the Q&A section to write your questions for her. Our speaker today is Dr. Lindsay Nelson, and she's an associate professor of political science and economics at Meiji University in Tokyo. She received her master's degree in comparative culture from Sophia University in Tokyo and a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Southern California. And her work has appeared in a number of journals: Journal of Japanese and Korean Cinema, East Asian Journal of Popular Culture, and Japanese Studies. And her book is, recent book is Circulating Fear, Japanese Horror, Fractured Realities, and New Media. And this was just published in 2021 by Lexington Books. So please join me in welcoming her to talk about Haunted Japan. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Miller, for that introduction. Thank you to everyone for being here today. Thank you again to Dr. Miller, to Dr. Rebecca Copeland, to Robert L., to the H.E. Shibusawa Seigo Arai Endowed Professorship in Japanese Studies, UMSL Global, and East Asian Languages and Cultures, Washington University in St. Louis for sponsoring and organizing this talk. So let me go ahead and share my PowerPoint with everyone and get it into slideshow mode. Here we go. Okay, let's see. Just figure out if I can get this right. Okay, so as you can see, the talk title today is Haunted Japan, the Evolution of J-Horror. And here we have some images on my screen, the famous image of Sadako crawling out of her television screen from the film The Ring. And then over on the other side, a poster for the latest film in the Ring franchise, Sadako DX, where things are perhaps a little more technologically advanced. And then in the middle, an image from the film series Nichanneru no Noroi, or Nichannel Curse, which I will also be talking about today. So just to give a little bit of an outline here, today I am going to give a brief introduction to J-horror, and then I am going to talk about tracking the evolution of J-horror via media technologies and devices. And the two main examples that I'm going to look at are the film Jukai Mura, or Suicide Forest Village, and Nichanneru no Noroi, or Nichannel Curse. And then finally, at the very end of the talk, I will be talking about my current project on haunted houses in Japanese cinema as a whole, and in particular in Japanese cinema. And I will just say that it was a challenge for me not to keep updating this talk until the very last minute, because it just seems like there's a lot going on in J-horror in a contemporary sense. I'm particularly amused that Sadako, the character from The Ring, now has her own YouTube channel, which is called Sadako no Idogarashi, or Sadako's Life in the Well. where she posts, the Kadokawa and other companies associated with her, and an actress posts sort of tongue-in-cheek YouTube style everyday life videos. As part of the promotion for the new Sadako DX film, she also appears in a rather lengthy video where she just sits silently as the text of a ghost story moves across the screen with some candles in front. And a production that I am so sad I will not be able to see because it is only performing in Osaka, which is a J-horror themed kabuki performance with Sadako, basically called Sadako and the Blood Mansion. Yeah, so it just seems like there are endless things going on with this topic. So as I mentioned, I want to start today by talking about this question of what is or was J-horror. So I think that when a lot of people hear the word J-horror, even if you're not, a horror movie aficionado, you might immediately think of films like The Ring or Ringu, directed by Nakata Hideo from 1998. You might also think of movies like the Grudge series, directed by Shimizu Takashi from 2002, or maybe a movie like Kaido or Pulse, directed by Kurosawa Kiyoshi from 2001. So this was a small group of films that came out in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I think the sort of J-horror boom period was rather quick. It started basically in the late 1990s and was pretty much over by the early 2000s. And obviously, scary movies from Japan existed long before the late 1990s. And what actually qualifies as J-horror is it's a bit debatable, but in general, I would say that J-horror refers to this brief period in a small group of films by a small group of directors. It was kind of the same small group of directors making movies that shared a particular aesthetic and tended to have similar characters and plots. So if we want to talk about the key features of J-horror, we might say that J-horror films tend to feature yurei or onryo, which are vengeful spirits. They put an emphasis kind of on suspense over gore. And I think this was particularly appealing to viewers in the United States at this time because horror films in the late 1990s and early 2000s in the United States tended to be quite violent. These are movies like Saw and Hostel and Turistas. This was a period when US horror films tended to be very gory. J-horror also really emphasized just a spooky atmosphere, a kind of eeriness in the films themselves. There were also a lot of female ghosts and monsters. And again, this was in contrast to a lot of slasher films in the US from the 1980s, where the killers were usually male or the monsters were usually coded as male. There was a lack of sex and nudity, again, I think a contrast with a lot of slasher films. This was just not really the focus of most J-horror. And the vengeful spirits in these films tended to have ambiguously directed rage, meaning that, they weren't necessarily after the people who had wronged them. It was just people who happened to cross their path. So it didn't matter if you weren't a bad person, they would still go after you. The monsters in these films were also not easily defeated. Often at the end of the film, they were still going strong and you weren't really sure what was going to happen. And finally, I think a lot of these films just emphasized the thing that lurks. There's just something lingering, maybe in a school or a house or a derelict building, and you don't know what it is, but it's a kind of stain or taint that infects everyone who comes into contact with it. So those are some of the kind of tropes, characters, plot features of Japanese horror. But I think that in addition to being a group of films by a particular group of directors, we might also characterize J-horror as a discursive movement. And this is something from Kinoshita Chika from a book chapter that she published in 2009. And I think a discursive movement is just kind of a fancy way of saying that this was a thing that was much talked about and a thing that was much written about. So these were films that were written by a small group of directors who were also film scholars. who were also kind of cinema geeks, and people like Kurosawa Kiyoshi, Shimizu Takashi, Tsuruta Norio, Nakata Hideo. These were young men who, growing up, had read French film magazines and were, very interested in cinema, and they tended to make movies and then write about each other's movies and comment on them and have these taidan, or kind of public conversations about these movies. So at the same time these films were being made, there was a lot of writing and a lot of talking going on about them. So this wasn't just a collection of films, it was also this collection of thought and writing that was happening at the same time. One other thing I want to mention about J-horror is the relationship between J-horror and found footage. So I think for most of us, when we think of J-horror, when we think of films like Ringu, we don't really think of found footage because most of the most famous J-horror films would not be considered found footage horror. But J-horror definitely has a lot of roots in the found footage genre. A lot of the directors who made some of the most famous J-horror films, like Nakata Hideo and Shimizu Takashi, worked on a TV series called Hontou ni Atta Kowai Hanashi, or True Scary Stories. This was a TV series that ran, that ran in the 90s and that continued into the 2000s. And it was basically just a series of short vignettes that claimed to reenact scary stories, ghost stories that were sent in by viewers. And these episodes were, made very cheaply. They had a kind of found footage aesthetic, just that, we're sort of watching a documentary about these scary things that happened. And so many of these directors took that aesthetic and took those ideas with them when they made movies like The Grudge and The Ring. So even if those aren't found footage horror films, they definitely borrow a lot from that aesthetic. Also, there is another film that's gotten less attention, which kind of came before the boom period, which is called Jagande, or Psychic Vision, which was released in 1988. And this is actually a found footage horror film. It's a film about a pop star who's trying to make it big, and it's about a haunted song. Essentially, there is a cassette tape with a song on it that is cursing anyone who listens to it. And the film is a found footage record of a journalist, who was kind of chronicling this pop star's rise to fame. I think this film is available on YouTube if anybody is interested in checking it out. So J-horror was incredibly influential both in Japan and around the world. You might have seen some of the English language remakes, for example, of films like The Ring or The Grudge or One Missed Call or Pulse. And there is also a Korean version of The Ring, which actually came out right around the same time as the first Ring film in Japan. And I think it's also important to realize that many non-Japanese countries have remade Japanese horror films, but J-horror was also heavily influenced by foreign films and foreign horror. And I think it's ironic that J-horror is often described as quintessentially Japanese or uniquely Japanese, when its creators and early critics in Japan really didn't see it that way. The directors of these films were more influenced by people like Peter Weir and Dario Argento and Tobe Hooper. And they, again, were people who read French film magazines and loved the Nouvelle Vague. One interesting story is that Nakata Hideo, the director of the Ring, first Ring film, has often said that he actually does not like horror films. That's not really his thing. It was just, these were the movies that he got paid to make so that he could finance his true passion projects, including a director on the the filmmaker and theater director, Joseph Losey. He was making this movie about Joseph Losey, and basically the studio came to him and said, look, can you please just make this horror movie for us? And he made Don't Look Up, which is kind of the precursor to Ring, primarily to finance his Joseph Losey documentary. And so I think the influence here is more of a loop than a one-way street. You have J-horror, of course, influencing Japan and cinema outside Japan, but you also have J-horror itself being heavily influenced by films and movements outside Japan. There's another story, which I haven't really been able to verify, but was told to me in a grad student seminar many years ago, about how certain Japanese film studios, when remakes were a very popular thing, certain Japanese film studios would actually consult with Hollywood film studios, and they would say to them, look, here's a treatment. We have this idea for this J-horror film. If we make it, would you be interested in remaking it? And if the studios responded yes, that film was more likely to get made. And if they said no, it was less likely to get made. So this is a kind of remaking before making phenomenon where Hollywood was so interested in J-horror that it would, snap up the remake rights before the film even got made. So what does this look like more recently? What is going on with Japanese horror in the 2010s and 2020s? Well, I would say that Japanese horror films are not getting remade as often as they used to. We don't see quite as many English language remakes these days. They are still being made, I think, largely because, as with the horror genre in general, they're cheap to make. It usually doesn't cost a lot of money to make a successful horror film. And they're often still being made by a lot of the same directors who were popular during the boom period. Nakata Hideo is still making movies. Recently, Ghost Theater, Gekijō-rei. He has also directed one or two of the Ring sequels. Shimizu Takashi has produced what he calls his Kyofu no Mura, or Scary Village trilogy, which includes this film, Jukai Mura, Suicide Forest Village, that I'll talk about later. Another interesting figure on the scene for the past 10 or so years has been Shiraishi Koji, who made Sadako versus Kayako, which is a kind of Grudge Ring mashup, and has also directed a lot of found footage horror films, and has kind of a different flavor from a lot of these other directors. In general, though, I feel like a lot of Japanese horror of the last 10 years tends to fall into a lot of problems. First of all, there is a reliance on aidoru and talento to sell the film. And aidoru being idol or pop stars, these are, young musical performers who are valued primarily for their attractiveness and their personality, not so much for their singing and dancing talent, and who inspire very passionate devotion from their fan base. Are not really trained actors either, but tend to be put into these movies as, young girls who scream a lot. And then talento being talent, or basically what we might call TV personalities in Japan. These are people who appear on variety shows and talk shows, and sometimes, dramas or sitcoms. Sometimes they sing, but again, they are more known for just their sort of pleasant good looks and personality, and also do not necessarily have a lot of acting talent. I think a lot of these most recent films also tend to focus on schlock over scares. It just tends to be more silly than genuinely scary. They do a lot of recycling of old characters and tropes. There's not a lot that's new in these films. And there's also been a sort of cutification of horror movement where, particularly in the marketing of these films, there seems to be this message that, don't worry, it's not scary, it's just silly. You can go see it with a date and you'll be fine. And a really fascinating example of this that I just came across on Netflix Japan, so I don't know if it will pop up in your Netflix queue if you access it in the United States, was this Howling Village for Scaredy Cats feature. So as I was searching through Netflix, one of the films that came up was this Shimizu Takashi film, Inunaki Mura, or Howling Village, which is the first of his Scary Village trilogy. But then right next to it, I saw this other image of this, person with this kind of goofy dog nose and ears, and it reads Inunaki Mura Kyofu Kaihi Bajon, which means scaredy cat version. So I clicked on this film, and I quickly discovered that it's basically the exact same film, except that right before the film, you get this sort of cutesy animation of a little dog that says, Kawagari-san ni mite hoshii, like for scaredy cats who want to watch the movie. And it plays the whole movie, but every couple of seconds, you get these little animated images of puppies or goofy text, basically telling you, oh, isn't this silly? Don't be scared. So I think this is a whole other project. I'm really fascinated by how this happened, and if there is actually a big enough audience of, scaredy cats who want to watch horror films. I didn't really realize that was a demographic that anyone was tackling. But anyway, that was a recent interesting discovery. So if we talk about the evolution of J-horror, I think one way to talk about it, and the primary way that I've talked about it in my book, is to talk about it through the evolution of media and media technology. So of course, in the original Ring film, Sadako transfers her curse via a VHS cassette. Which she I think feels kind of quaint to a lot of us now, and particularly to younger people. So here, if you look at these images, we have an image of those two young women. This is from the more recent 2015 film Sadako versus Kayako, which actually includes a segment at the beginning where one young woman explains to another what a VHS cassette is, because she's never seen one before. And then this urgent image, this is from another later English language film called Rings, where Sadako's curse is transmitted via email and via the internet. Down below, we have a couple of images of from the film Sadako, where one of the main characters is a YouTuber. And is trying to get YouTube fame through making videos about Sadako. And finally, the most recent image, this again is from Sadako DX, where I have not seen this one yet, it hasn't come out yet, but it seems like the focus is more on smartphones and how Sadako is able to infect via smartphone technology. So in thinking about how J-horror has evolved and how its representation of media has evolved, I came across this quote from Maekawa Osamu, who says, Japanese horror films of the late 1990s and early 2000s frequently made use of frames within frames, screens within screens. And this layering of frames and screens included J-horror's origin as a primarily video-based format. And this really spoke to me, I think, because I definitely agree that a lot of J-horror does do this kind of frame within frame trick where you're watching the film, but you're also watching someone else, watching something who then might also be watching something else. So it becomes a kind of hall of mirrors. And this led me to the work of Anne Friedberg, who has talked a lot about just the concept of the window and how windows and frames, whether it's, the windows in your laptop screen or the way that information is organized in little boxes on your smartphone, really affect just how we see the world and how we think about information. And she says, the limits and multiplicities of our frames of vision determine boundaries and multiplicities of our world. We now receive information in spatially and temporally fractured frames. And this idea of spatially and temporally fractured frames really spoke to me, just this way that we get our information in these frames, but they're fractured, they're odd in space and time in that way. And I think we can definitely see this with a lot of recent J-horror. And this, of course, also relates to just new media as a concept. Lev Manovich talks about how new media change our concept of what an image is, because they turn the viewer into an active user. And the new media image is something that the user actually goes into. New media turn most images into image interfaces and image instruments. And I think if we think about this, we can really see how older media like newspapers, cassette tapes, even television were very passive in the sense that we watched, we looked at, whereas new media, things like social media, the internet, YouTube, these are much more interactive. We're not only watching, we're also commenting. In some cases, we're creating our own content, or in platforms like TikTok, we're duetting. We're taking someone else's content and adding to it. And so this, becomes a much more engaged and interactive way of looking at images and way of dealing with images than we've ever seen before. There was another interesting example of this in one of the recent English language Ring film remakes. As part of the marketing, there was an app that was advertised where you could download the app, and as you watched the film, in the middle of the film, you would receive a phone call on your phone. And as you're watching the film, you would pick up your phone, and then you would hear a voice that would say 7 days or something like that. So again, just a very interactive viewing experience where you weren't just watching the film, you could actually, watch it and engage with something on your smartphone at the same time. So in looking at a lot of more recent J-horror, I think we can see not only different types of media and media devices being depicted, but also just the importance of screens and frames and windows, and the way that terror now comes not only from ghosts breaking the fourth wall and leaping out of the screen toward us, as in this image from Sadako 3D, but also there's a risk of us falling into the screen. And we see this sometimes in these films as well, where there are scenes that someone is pulled into a screen, or with the 3D technology, we might fear that we ourselves are also falling into the screen. So I'd like to now move on to talk about some specific film examples. So I've mentioned before this Scary Village trilogy. The 3 films in it are Howling Village, Suicide Forest Village, and Cow's Neck Village. As you can see, all of these films came out in a 3-4 year period. So these 3 films are ostensibly all based on different urban legends, Japanese urban legends. You have the first one based on the Inunaki Tunnel story about this remote countryside tunnel that was supposedly the site of terrible violence. You have Suicide Forest Village, which is based on Aokigahara, the forest at the base of Mount Fuji that is known as a place where people go to die by suicide, and I think has been talked about a great deal in both English language and Japanese media. And then finally, Cow's Neck Village, which is based on this urban legend of Cow's Head or Cow's Neck, which is basically just a story that is so terrifying that if you hear it, you go crazy. And all 3 of these films kind of take liberties with these urban legends. They sort of use the titles, but then they just kind of take off running from there and bring in a whole bunch of other ideas. So taking a look at Suicide Forest Village. So again, this film takes place in Aokigahara, the so-called suicide forest. And I have a whole chapter in my book on depictions of Aokigahara in media, if you want to know more about that. So again, it has become well known as a place where people go to die by suicide, and there have been several English language films made about it. Famously, though, Yamanashi Prefecture, where the forest is located, has long forbidden film crews to shoot films there because they don't want to draw attention to it and sensationalize it. Of course, many people still walk into the forest and shoot footage with their smartphones, but if you were a film crew, with a great big truck and a lot of stuff, you would probably have trouble getting inside. However, an exception was made for this film, which depicts 2 sisters trying to solve the mystery of why their mother may have died by suicide in Aokigahara. And the reasons behind why they managed to get permission are kind of complicated and interesting, I think. I think the basic explanation is that the new mayor of Yamanashi Prefecture decided that maybe it was time to stop fighting people's interest in this place, and if they could somehow work with the studio to also promote it as a place of scenic beauty, then it could work for them. I think also they realized that the film itself is very fantastical and actually does not really focus on suicide. And so they were a little more amenable to letting the film crew shoot there. So what interests me in particular about this film and about the Scary Village trilogy is that in all three films, there is a character named Akina. She is a fictional YouTuber played by the actress Oltani Rinka, and she appears in all three films. Spoiler alert, she appears at the beginning of each film and she dies every time. She is kind of our gateway into the story, but she meets a tragic end in each film, but she is magically reborn for the second and third films. So here we see her in Howling Village, Suicide Forest Village, and Cow's Neck Village. And she always opens the film usually as her YouTuber self, usually live broadcasting something. So she's live broadcasting from the Howling Village or from Suicide Forest Village or from Cow's Neck Village, and then bad things happen to her. For Suicide Forest Village, she also participated in a promotional video series from Yamanashi Prefecture, again, as the Akina character that was designed to promote the scenic beauty of Aokigahara. So these videos ran online. I think they maybe also played in some theaters. And basically they just show her, as you can see here, again, as her Akina character. She is wearing the same costume. And the text basically says, you know, this is an ancient forest full of, you know, a place you absolutely want to go in Japan. So it's in direct contrast to the way that the forest is depicted in the movie, which is, you know, kind of a scary place. And at the same time, there is also a fictional Akina YouTube channel, which still exists. They created an entire YouTube channel for this character where, again, as a character, she sort of makes cutesy cooking videos and videos of herself doing yoga. So there was this whole kind of world established for this character before she started appearing in the film. So again, actress Oltani Rinka, but playing this Akina character. And in one particular news article describing the collaboration between Yamanashi Prefecture and Suicide Forest Village with this promotional video that she made promoting the forest, the actress is described as flying out of the screen and into the real world. Which again, just really, I think, brings home the idea of the importance of windows, frames, and screens, because for the most part, we see her in this other frame, which is as this scared, you know, character in the scary movie. But then she flies out of and lands in a completely different frame, a different context, where she is a promoter of this lovely place where you can go hiking and see this beautiful forest. So I think in the character of Akina and in all of these films' depictions of YouTube, social media, and computers, we can see how a lot of recent Japanese horror relies just on different types of screens and screens within screens, frames within frames, and also just forces the audience to constantly shift perspective. You know, if you are watching Suicide Forest Village and if you're engaging in the marketing materials or media that surrounds it. You know, one minute you're watching a film, the next minute you're watching a YouTube video, the next minute you're watching a promotional video, and your perspective shifts, you know, from someone who's watching her to then maybe someone who's being watched because the camera turns back to you. And it's this kind of, I think, disorienting feeling that a lot of these films produce. So the next group of films that I want to talk about is the Ni Channel no Noroi series, which began in 2010 and continued making films through the mid to late 2010s. And these are a series of mostly straight-to-video film collections. So each DVD has maybe 5 or 6 short films, and these are all sort of urban legends that are taken from the Nichanneru website occult message board. And these are, stories of, this is a thing that happened to me, this scary thing happened to me. And there's also one feature film in this group. So just a little bit of background on Nichanneru or Nichannel. You might have heard of its descendant, 4chan, which I think has a reputation as a hotbed of alt-right and misogynistic activity. And like Nichanneru is basically just a collection of bulletin boards, a text-based website where people can create and comment on threads of any kind. Hundreds of thousands of topics. And again, it is text-based. So it looks like Reddit or 4chan or a lot of these websites that are mostly focused on text. At one time, it was the most visited website in Japan and got millions of hits every month. It was incredibly influential. And even people who didn't use it were aware of kind of Nichanneru slang or news stories that were born on Nichanneru. And people on Nichanneru use very, very specific slang, and they use text to create all of this kind of goofy art. So for someone who doesn't really understand the site, it can be really overwhelming, even for a native Japanese language speaker to try to figure out how anything works. But one of the boards, the kind of collections of threads, was called Occult or Occult, and it was within these forums that a lot of the Nichanneru no Noroi, Nichannel curse stories came from. And it is also the example, as far as I know, of one of the first urban legends that was actually born on the internet. It did not start with word of mouth. It actually started on the internet, and that's the legend of Kune Kune, which is this story of two young boys who go to the countryside and see a scary white figure in a field. And it is reported, at least, that this story began on Nichanneru and then gradually moved to the larger internet. So one of the stories from the Nichannel Curse series is called Webcam Call or Web Camera Tsua. And in this short film, as you can see here from this footage, I don't really need the volume, basically you have a group of people sitting around via their computers in this kind of proto-Zoom image here, and they are participating in a very old and traditional activity, which is the Hyakumonogatari Kaidankai, or the telling of 100 ghost stories, which is something that traditionally happens in August, often at temples, and people will get together and tell 100 ghost stories. And after they tell each story, they will blow out one of the candles in the room. So as the night goes on, the room gets steadily darker. So that is what they are doing here, but they are doing it again via their computers. So it's this interesting juxtaposition of a very traditional activity with very modern technology. And I love this particular image, again, just because this idea of frames within frames, we're watching this film, then within the film, we have the image of a laptop screen, and then within the laptop screen, we have 4 more smaller images of these kind of 4 separate universes, 4 separate worlds with these people with their little candles. Telling their story. And I also love just the contrast of their candles, but also the kind of eerie glow of the computer screen, which I think has replaced, the hearth or the warm light of a candle for a lot of people these days. And pulling back even further, this is an image of me watching this film on my own very cluttered physical desktop, where as I watch this film on my laptop, as you can see, it is just one of many tabs on my screen. So, and I think that this is how a lot of us watch films these days, is it's just one square within many others. And so we have me, we have my laptop, we have this image of the film, and then there is this young man in the film who is also watching something on his computer. So it really does become kind of a hall of mirrors that just does not end. So in thinking about all that, I just think that in contemporary Japanese horror films, screens, social media devices, and social media platforms are becoming the means through which we consume horror films. And they are also central characters and devices in those films. So we have not only films that are focused on these devices and these technologies, but they're also becoming the way that these stories are disseminated, given that now a lot of us watch these films on our phones or on our laptops, and we hear about them through social media. So there's this sort of fascinating connection between the narratives themselves, the plots of these stories, and how they are disseminated and shared. And I'll be really interested to see how this continues to change as technology continues to evolve and we get sort of new media devices and technologies. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about my new project, which is related to haunted houses in Japanese cinema. So one thing that I have been noticing over the last couple of years as I've looked at newer horror films is that there has been a really interesting focus on the home. And this is not new. I think a lot of Japanese horror films have focused on the family, the home spaces, things like that. But there's a new angle happening in the last 5 or 6 years with a focus on stigmatized properties, or what they call jikobukken. And basically, these are houses or apartments in Japan that are stigmatized, usually because of a death, usually because someone died there. Maybe they, just died of old age. Maybe they died violently. Maybe they died by suicide. But basically, the houses, the apartments are rented more cheaply because they are stigmatized in some way. And in recent years, stigmatized properties have actually become a kind of popular option for people who don't have a lot of money, just because they know that they can rent these apartments cheaply. There is a sort of frightening loophole in the legal issues surrounding stigmatized properties. Apparently, if you want to move into one of these properties and the person who lived there before you is the one who died, or that was when the violence happened, the landlord is required to tell you. But if it happened 2 times before, they're not required to say anything. So some people move into stigmatized properties without realizing they're doing so. So a couple of films that have focused on this, there's The Inerasable, a 2015 film from Nakamoto Yoshihiro, which focuses on a mystery writer who's kind of chronicling an experience with stigmatized properties. And then Ring director Nakata Hideo recently produced the film Jikobukken, Stigmatized Properties, which is actually based on a book by a comedian who was down on his luck and decided as a way to make money that he would live rent-free in a series of stigmatized properties and film videos of what happened and write about it. So the film is based on that. I'm also looking more specifically at a very interesting little film called Watashitachi no Ie, or Our House, from 2017, directed by Kiyohara Gui. This film was part of the Tokyo Arts University's grad school film project. Kiyohara, as far as I can tell, has not directed many other films since then, but the film is interesting to me in particular because there are not many women making horror films in Japan. In addition to Kiyohara, there is Asato Mari, who I've also written about, but not many others. And both Kiyohara and Asato are actually proteges, you could say, of Kurosawa Kiyoshi. They studied under him at the same university. And Our House is a really fascinating film, basically about a doppelganger house. It is about one house in which 2 pairs of women exist simultaneously. So there are 2 parallel stories going on, but they're happening in the exact same house. And every now and then we just get hints that maybe these women are aware of each other. They hear these strange noises coming through the walls, or at one point someone pokes a hole in a shoji screen to see if they can kind of see into the other world. And I don't know that I would call this film a horror film necessarily. I do think it is spooky. I think it is suspenseful. It leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And I think it just has interesting things to say about the idea of the home as a kind of repository of memories, both good and bad. And, what does it mean when the memories are perhaps of the present and not of the past? And it also raises an interesting question, I think, about where the home's boundaries begin and end, and where domestic space begins and ends. And in particular, I think this is interesting when the central characters are women. So that is just something that I am in the very early stages of working on, and I look forward to learning more about it. So thank you very much for your attention. Again, my recent book is Circulating Fear, Japanese Horror, Fractured Realities, and New Media. And here is my contact information. And I really look forward to any comments or questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Nelson. And also thank you, Dr. Miller, for setting this wonderful occasion up. We would like to invite people to ask questions via the Q&A button. And I see that we already have a couple there, so I'm going to go ahead and turn to that. We have some comments and questions from AJN van der Slam, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but first of all, there's the suggestion that the kabuki that you referred to is perhaps not Blood Mansion, but the Bancho Sarayashiki or Dish Mansion. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. You're right. I think, and Michael Crandall has actually written a lot about this as well in his wonderful new book, Ghost in the Well. The Dish Mansion at Bancho is this very early Japanese horror film, actually, that was also a kabuki play. For whatever reason, I think a lot of the English ad copy for this kabuki play is calling it Blood Mansion. I guess that sounds a little more exciting. But yes, Dish Mansion at Bancho is probably the more accurate translation.
Still sounds like it would be worth leaving Tokyo just to
I know, yeah. I'm tempted actually to see if I can
just a quick little Shinkansen, right? Yeah. Okay, so here we have a comment and a question also from the same commenter, and we know that I'm reading, my impression is that what constitutes J-horror relies very much on is this Wittgenstein type family resemblances. It's hard to put the various J-horror films into one category. Rather, the more a film is like a prototypical J-horror film, like Ringu, the more likely the audience will consume it as J-horror. Do you think that with the more recent films, the quintessential J-horror film is shifting away from the late 90s origins, or are those still the touchstone for what it means for a film to be J-horror?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that, in a lot of early writing on J-horror, particularly in English in the early 2000s, there was a tendency to lump a lot of films together. Just if they came from Japan and they were scary, then they were J-horror. More recently, I think people like Kinoshita Chika and Michael Crandall as well have talked about how if you say the word J-horror, I think it's a little more specific, and it kind of refers mostly to films like The Ring, The Grudge, Pulse, films that focus on spookiness, vengeful female spirits, and a kind of spooky atmosphere. So, for example, Miike Takashi's films like Audition and Ichi the Killer used to be lumped in with J-horror, but I think these days most people would say, no, that's not really the same thing. Those films are incredibly violent and bloody and sexual, and they're a bit different. And so I think in terms of recent films, I do think that a lot of recent films are banking on people's memories of the sort of quintessential J-horror films like The Ring and The Grudge. So they are recycling a lot of these titles and plot points in the hopes of perhaps drawing in people who were fans of these original films. But from my perspective, I don't think it's necessarily a good approach, just because I feel like, unfortunately, they're just often very tired. They're just kind of repeating a lot of the same things that people are used to. But of course, I mean, audiences do enjoy familiar things. So some of these films have been reasonably successful, but I do think that a lot of the recent films are trying to make a connection between the sort of classic J-horror.
Thank you. And Dr. Miller, I think you have a question.
Yeah, do you think, would you include the film Shikoku as a J-horror? Because it does have it's not violent. It has a female ghost who is kind of a Yurei or Goryeo type spirit.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's and again, if we think of J-horror as a discursive movement more than a collection of particular storylines or character types, I think that works as well. It's and I think I'm in line with a lot of people these days in thinking about genre where the rules don't have to be super strict. You know, you don't have to say like, well, this is J-horror and this isn't, depending on you know, what characters and motifs appear. So I guess I tend to organize J-horror more in terms of a timeline and a group of directors. So of course a film like Shikoku could be considered J-horror, but for me, it tends to be more about the fact that it was directed by this particular group of guys who came up around the same time, who had the same influences, who worked in television first, and then you know, tended to make movies and comment on each other's movies and, you know, kind of exist in this circle. So that's kind of what I connected to, but it is a very, very broad term that can definitely be connected to a lot of other films as well.
Thank you. I'm going to move to a question by another member of the audience, and then I'll come back to, we have another question by Vanderslam. Emerald King, I think writing from Australia, asks, I love watching the development of J-horror and technology and the cantering of women in these films as the expected screaming victim, but also as the less expected villain. I wonder how the AirPod, iPhone, earbuds, and smartwatches will be used in future horror films. And I wonder how it will avoid going into well-trodden sci-fi like Doctor Who's Cyberman territory.
Yeah. Wow. No, me too. I'm really fascinated to see where J-horror goes. I feel like we're still, if I'm looking at Sadako DX, which again I haven't seen, so I'll have to see what they do with that. But our most modern technology so far in these films still appears to be smartphones. Although I have seen there have been one or two films, sort of small scale films released very recently that do use Zoom. So where a lot of the scares focus on Zoom calls. So there is that, but yeah, I haven't seen anything yet with like AirPods and Apple Watches. So given the increasingly invasive nature of a lot of new media technology and how it, you know, the extent to which it can monitor us, I'm sure that will definitely be a component of a lot of J-horror going forward.
So here's another question from an unnamed member of the audience. Do you think the depiction of haunted houses in Japan have links with a unchanging concept of home? What has changed and what has remained constant?
Yeah, great question. Definitely. I think that, and this is something that I'm reading a lot about right now, is kind of social histories of the home in Japan and the concept of, you know, home and family, and even just the different words that people use, like ie versus kate, and how in particular within major cities in Japan, just the concept of housing and home has gone through so many changes, where, you know, before the Meiji period, the home space was a lot more vaguely defined, where you had, you know, the nuclear family, but you also had aunts and uncles and cousins and servants, and there was not this clear dividing line between this is family, this is not, or this is the home space and this is not. And then suddenly you had with different kinds of influences, you had this drive where in order to create, you know, the sort of ieseido, the kind of family system, which would be an extension of the state, you also had to reimagine the physical space of the home. And in a lot of cases, this meant redesigning homes to be more Western.
Mhm.
So telling people, for example, that it was not okay for everyone to eat their meals on a separate tray. You had to have a table and everyone had to sit around it, and that this would somehow transform families from being kind of separate to being more unified. So all of that, I think, definitely comes through in cinematic depictions of home. If you look at older Japanese films and the way that the home is depicted, just the fact that, of course, in older films, most people are living in a house, and they are living in a house with clearly designated areas, for sleeping and living. Whereas in J-horror, particularly from the late 1990s onward, it's mostly apartments, and sometimes it's danchi. And in particular, films like Pulse really focus on urban loneliness and the kind of isolation that people feel in these sort of individual boxes that are not very homey. And then in more recent movies like Stigmatized Properties, you have this situation where people, have bought this home and they want to live there, but it immediately becomes unhomely through the presence of these ghosts or spirits. And it just becomes this desperate search to actually find a home or a welcoming space that they can't, not only because of the kind of day-to-day concerns of things like money or family, but also because of the ghosts and the spirits. So yeah, I think I'm really fascinated by the way that ideas about home and ideas about domestic spaces have changed. And we can really see that, I think, in a lot of Japanese cinema and Japanese horror cinema depictions of that.
That's fascinating. So here's another question, and this is from Catherine Stevens. And she states, you mentioned TikTok in the presentation, and I was wondering if you could expand on its potential vis-a-vis horror media, especially in connection to the emphasis on interactivity and frames within frames. I'm also interested in the breakdown between the fantasy world depicted in horror films and real life, such as in your Akina example, where the actress, as her character, has a YouTube channel depicting her daily routine. And I'm wondering if TikTok might have a similar potential to disturb this demarcation between real and fantasy.
Excellent question. Yeah, thank you. I'm 45 years old, and so I feel kind of alienated by TikTok. It is intimidating to me because I turn it on and there's video and then there's text and there's an ad and it automatically moves between videos and I don't know how to search things. So it's still exhausting for me to engage with, but obviously so much potential for really interesting horror content, I think. And something similar that I've seen, there is one film, and I think there are a couple of others. There's one film called Toshimaen, which focuses on Nico Nico, which is kind of the Japanese equivalent of YouTube, but with a very interesting difference, which is that users of Nico Nico can comment live on a video, and those text comments will actually scroll across the video screen. So they become part of the video content. And I think that's kind of similar to what TikTok does in that it's, this content that is always being reshaped as it's being made. So yeah, I think that there will be a lot of potential. I think a lot of J-horror filmmakers are also older people, so they're going to have to get educated very quickly if they want to make films that focus on TikTok, or they're going to have to consult perhaps with some younger people. In terms of the breakdown between the fantasy world and real life, this is something that's been going on for a very long time. In the earliest marketing campaigns for the Ring films, for example, in the United States, one of the ways that these films were marketed was to leave video cassettes in random places around cities. And then people would find the video cassette and they would open it up and it would say, "Watch me," or something. And then you would put the video cassette in the player and it would play you this weird footage or something. So that kind of, I think, like paratextual marketing has been a part of this for a long time. Now it's just on steroids because, of course, we have so many different social media platforms. We have our smartphones. We are constantly engaged with hype and with marketing and everything that surrounds films and television shows. So in the case of Akina, I feel like that was just a natural extension of all of this, to have this fictional character who, you know, continues as her fictional character self to produce just more content that people who are interested in this film can engage with, or maybe people who like the actress can engage with as well. And I think that's part of Japan's sort of classic media mix marketing strategy, where even if you're not interested in the movie, you might be interested in this model or actress. So she's going to produce some content that you can then engage with. And then maybe that'll make you interested in the movie and you'll go see it. Or maybe you might like to buy the little pamphlet that comes with glossy pictures of her or the other sort of tarento or pop stars who appear in this film. Yeah, I think we'll continue to see a lot more of that kind of blurring of the lines between the fictional world of film and the quote unquote real world of a lot of the marketing that is happening to promote the films.
Laura, you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, talking about the marketing. So, you know, I'm having this exhibit and students are collecting objects. And so, of course, there's objects or merch for everything. And I'm wondering if that's, you know, if that's another area that you discuss in your book, the merchandise. Okay.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think.
Your book, yeah.
And this is really funny because I had assumed that when it came to horror films, the merch angle would not be so central.
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, when it comes to romantic comedies or dramas or anime films, of course, people want to get their cute keychains and stickers and things like that.
Yeah.
I didn't really think that that would be the case with horror films, but I was wrong. And in fact, when it comes to the promotion of like the Ring films, you can go online and get cutesy Sadako stickers. You can, you know, there are promotional tie-ins now at different cafes where you can get like a creepy Sadako themed, you know, coffee drink. So the merch is there. Absolutely.
Right. When I was making the poster for this, I mean, I went online looking for images and I just saw, you know, plushies and, you know, Sadako art and plushies and really cute images. I mean, it was just amazing.
Yeah, Sadako has been fully cutified.
Yeah.
So many cutesy Sadako things out there right now.
Thank you.
This kind of goes to your earlier discussion. Matthew Taylor asks, are there any demographic nuances of fans and viewers? Who's watching? Could recycling old or pre-used elements in part be a way to connect new viewers, generations with the historical? Like sampling old beats into current music?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think Mitsuyo Wada Marciano has talked a little bit about this, about how a lot of the early success of J-horror hinged on high school girls, actually, who kind of spread word about these movies through word of mouth and went to see the movies in groups. So it was young women, which was kind of surprising to me because I feel like, particularly in the 80s and 90s in the United States, the stereotype was that most horror audiences were men. And that is actually not true. If you look at a lot of the data from the 1930s onward, actually women have always made up a key component of horror audiences. Today, I don't remember a lot of the details, but I do know that from my own experience, just going to watch horror films in a theater in Japan, it really depends a lot on who's in the film. And I find this as well with my own students at Meiji. When I ask them, you know, what makes you decide to go see a film, they really care about the actors. And so they will go see a film, regardless of what type of film it is, if the actor's in it. And a lot of the marketing around Japanese horror films also knows that. So for example, a couple of years ago, there was a film that came out called Kodomo with Sky. I think it was, English title was like the Ghost Whisperer, the Child Whisperer or something like that. Innocent Curse, that was the English title. And it featured two young men who were Johnny's idols, you know, these young male pop stars. And the marketing for that film was just a blitzkrieg of glossy photos of these handsome young men. So many magazines, so many posters. And not surprisingly, I remember when I went to see the film, I think on like a weekday afternoon, the theater was pretty crowded and it was almost all groups of young women. And they all had their pamphlet, they all had their, their little pictures of the guys. But for a movie like one of the Ring sequels, for example, it might be a completely different demographic. And I know that when I've gone to see, I think I went to see a recent Kurosawa Kiyoshi film in the theaters, and it was mostly, I would say, people older than me. So a lot of people in their 50s and 60s. So yeah, it's a really wide range of people. And I was just mentioning to our host before we started that I know that my students at Meiji, at least, do not seem to watch horror films, or at least they tell me they don't. They are too scared. They don't like them. So maybe they would change their mind if their favorite, pop star or idol appeared in the film. But yeah, ostensibly, at least, a lot of university age students in Japan do not watch horror films. So seems like the audience for a lot of these films is just really varied depending on the film, depending on the director, and depending on who is appearing in it.
Oh, okay. I have to catch up. I thought it was something more younger people were doing. Now I'm ashamed that I should catch up. Anyway, speaking of catching up, I want to go back and catch a question that was asked earlier that I skipped over. And this is again from Vandersvam. It's an important question. They ask, previous research focuses on how horror films, J-horror, reflects developments or maybe problems in contemporary Japanese society. But you moved that focus to the role of technology. Should we understand the fact that these technological aspects are taken up in a horror genre as somehow critical of the technologies? Is it more playful? Other approaches, interpretations, perhaps? I'd be curious to learn more about your views on these issues.
Yes, thank you. And definitely, I think a lot of early writing on J-horror, like Nightmare Japan, work from people like Jay McRoy, has definitely focused on the connection between Japanese horror films and social issues. And I talked about this as well in a lot of my early work. A lot of early J-horror, deals with things like single parenthood and urban loneliness and child abuse or child neglect. And so you tended to have these films that sort of had two layers of horror. There was the ghosts, and then there was just the mundane, everyday survival of life. And I think in terms of how technology is depicted in these films, I think that if we look at horror films in general, technology is often evil, whether it's TV, whether it's VCRs, whether it's computers, there is usually some kind of not so subtle message about how technology is bad. It rarely comes off well in these films. So I think a lot of the more recent films are perhaps not so different. I do think that, for example, in one of the Sadako sequels, which is just called Sadako, where there is a character who wants to become famous as a YouTuber, the message is pretty blunt that this is a bad idea and that being a YouTuber is not a good thing and that YouTube is not a good medium. And to me, I don't know if Nakata Hideo actually sat down and said, okay, I'm going to warn people against YouTube. But I do think that if you look at the Japanese media's discussion of YouTube, and in particular, the fact that when you do these annual surveys of children of what do you want to be when you grow up, recently YouTuber has been at the top of the list, and Japan is not happy about this. There has been a lot of hand wringing about the fact that young people want to become YouTubers instead of, company presidents or something. So I think that in a movie like Sadako, the message is pretty clear: become a YouTuber and you'll die. And I see that as well in definitely a lot of the films that just depict the internet or social media. There is this message that, you often have a teacher character who says, hey, be careful, don't go to those weird sites. That's dangerous. And usually the teenagers who disobey that rule don't meet a good end. So yeah, I think that we can often see subtle or not so subtle messaging in these films that just tends to say that, you know, that all this newfangled technology is maybe not such a good thing.
Good. Well, we're going to move from technology to food. I just want people to know that we still have time. There are a few more questions in the queue, but we still have time. So don't hesitate to add a question. This again from Emerald King. The mention of TikTok and Nico Doga made me think of creepypasta, the internet lore creepypasta. And it occurred to me that I don't know if there is a Japanese equivalent. Is there creepy ramen?
If there isn't, there should be. That's great. Yeah, you know, I think that, again, if we look at Nichanneru, if we look at this very famous message board and the occult message board, on Nichanneru, we do see something similar to the creepypasta. So creepypasta comes from copy paste, and this idea of ghost stories that are just kind of copy pasted over and over on the internet, which is different from how those stories used to be told, because in the past, when folklore was shared mostly through word of mouth, it tended to evolve and change. Whereas if it's copy pasted, it really doesn't change. Like the story just stays exactly the same. So I think even if it's not called creepypasta, we do see something similar in Nichanneru where certain stories get repeated again and again, or they start out on Nichanneru and then they're copy pasted and posted somewhere else, maybe on social media like that. So yes, similar things happening, even if it's under a different name.
Thank you. So here we have a question from Deborah Cohen, and she asks, I would be interested in having you discuss how you theorize the relationship between film and Japanese culture. She notes, I'm not a Japan scholar, and I'm curious about how you see the relationship generally and specifically for Japan.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. This is tricky. I think that, first of all, I'm always very quick to say that film is film and culture is culture. And we should not look to film to be a mirror for culture. You know, just because you watch Japanese films does not mean that now you have some deep understanding of Japanese culture. You know, films are products of culture. I think obviously films are products of a particular historical moment. They are products of culture. And we can, of course, look to films for a certain amount of reflection of, you know, things that people worry about, things that people are focused about. If we look at movies that are made in the 1990s versus the 2000s, you know, we see different attitudes to things like the internet or social media. And those are, I think, a reflection of what a lot of people were thinking at that time. But at the same time, we also have to be very careful not to paint with too broad a brush and not to say that, you know, oh, because this particular film depicted a Japanese family that where the, you know, the father is abusive, that means that, you know, all families in Japan have abusive fathers. And, you know, this goes back as far as like Ruth Benedict writing The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, who, you know, did not go to Japan, but she admitted that she relied a lot on Japanese films for, you know, her assessment and analysis of Japanese culture, which again, it's like, it's a place to start, but it's dangerous, I think, to confuse depictions in films for some sort of, you know, unbiased, you know, camera sitting on the floor reflection of reality. So on the one hand, yeah, I think that obviously any film from any country reflects certain norms and certain attitudes of the time, but it is also, you know, one film made by one person in a very, very diverse country full of many, many different perspectives. So we have to be careful not to assign too much clout, I think, to depictions of any aspect of Japanese culture in film.
Thank you. It's very thoughtful. I work in literature, and I can say the same for Japanese fiction. Yeah. So here's another question from an unnamed member of the audience. Near the beginning, you talked about how J. Hara is being made into something cute and comedic. what are your thoughts on the idea that, in a sense, empowered female onryo are made cute and tamed or domesticated through such media, losing their empowerment in the process, perhaps?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I have ever seen characters like Sadako or Kayako from The Grudge as empowered or as examples of like female empowerment. I've always kind of seen them as tragic, and they are frightening. Sure, they are, frightening in their ability and their rage, but I don't know that I've ever really seen them as empowered. But in terms of seeing them cutified, I think it's just inevitable. I think that almost every famous character or politician or actor ends up cutified at some point in Japan. And I don't necessarily see it as condescending or stripping them of their power. I think that, if you walk around Japan, if you walk around Tokyo on a daily basis, you will see so many kind of mundane things that have been made cute, whether it's traffic cones or instructional videos for how to set up your bank account. It's just very common to include things that I think people outside Japan might see as childish, but that people inside Japan just see as soft or gentle and comforting. And so the fact that that has also happened to Sadako and Kayako, to me, it feels a little silly, because these are scary characters, and I imagine them as being very scary, but it just also feels very natural, as I think something that happens to any ubiquitous image or character in Japan.
Okay, thanks. So another question from unnamed member of the audience: what changes, if any, have you noticed with J-horror themes during and post-COVID? Do you think there are some themes which will continue to be explored for a long time post-COVID? So far, at least, I have not seen any Japanese films that directly address the pandemic, any horror films that directly address the pandemic. There's one film, as I mentioned, where it is clear that the characters are walking around wearing masks, and the film begins with a Zoom call. But I don't think those characters specifically mention the pandemic, or they don't really focus on it. One interesting side effect of the pandemic and how it affects the Japanese film industry, which I think is a worldwide thing, is just the fact that so many Japanese films were released on streaming instead of theaters. And this was huge because Japan is not into that. And there was actually an interesting roundtable between several directors, including Hirokazu Koreda, as part of the Tokyo International Film Festival last year, where they talked about this. And this one particular director was saying that, his production company was like, well, we can release it in the theaters, but nobody's going to go because the theaters are all shut down. Or Amazon's offered us a deal. We can release it on Amazon. And he was incredibly resistant. He was just like, no, I am a filmmaker. My movies are in theaters. But he finally, kowtowed, because he was just like, it's either this or nothing. And then the film was released on Amazon, and he admitted, he said, my film suddenly had all these viewers that it never would have had otherwise. Its audience was huge. And also I got comments. People were commenting on my film, and I'd never seen this before, and they had a lot to say. So I think it's kind of typical of an older generation of filmmakers who just don't really engage with this kind of stuff. And so with horror as well, one really interesting thing that happened, for example, was that Inunaki Mura, Howling Village, was one of the last films to be released before all the movie theaters shut down in Japan. It was, in fact, the last movie I saw in a movie theater before the pandemic started. It was one of the most successful films of 2020, only because it had very little competition. Yeah. And so that, was obviously a very unique situation, but, kind of changed things. And then I think as well for horror films, given that a lot of them had to be released on streaming rather than video, it did open them up to a new audience that might otherwise not
have been exposed to them, or might not have, gone to the theater to see them. So it remains to be seen how much of that is going to continue in a post-COVID world. I think some directors, are kind of keen on this new system, and they're happy to have the bigger audience. But I think some older directors are kind of like, okay, pandemic's over, let's go back to the theater model, because I prefer that. So we'll see what happens.
Great. So another question from another unnamed attendee. Maybe they're all the same. But
hello, anonymous.
Do you think there has been an increase or decline in attempts to globalize or commercialize J-horror to a global audience in recent years? What are the challenges, if any? Asking because there are hardly any J-horror releases licensed for screening in my country, and I'm always craving more.
I know, I'm so sorry about that. I think that, there's been a conversation over the last couple of decades about Japan's approach to international movie marketing, and how, for the most part, the Japanese film industry remains very inward looking, particularly compared to Korea. Which, when it comes to pop music, when it comes to film, when it comes to television, has been very aggressive and very successful in its international marketing, not only in its marketing, but in actually crafting content for a global audience, and not only for a Korean audience. Whereas in Japan, obviously anime is a worldwide phenomenon, and there's been incredible success with the exporting of anime. But when it comes to other aspects of Japanese pop culture, like television or pop music or film, so much of it tends to look inward. And what that means also is that it tends to rely on a very specific cultural knowledge. So if you're talking about certain Japanese TV shows, for example, there are so many in-jokes and so many references to other aspects of Japanese life and pop culture that they just don't transfer well. There are exceptions, of course, and Terrace House has been incredibly popular overseas. And certain, Japanese films, of course, like the films by people like Koreda, are festival darlings. And, movies like One Cut of the Dead are really successful, but they're kind of outliers. And we just don't see, I think, a lot of Japanese film studios just don't really feel like there's a lot of incentive for them to go global. They're fine with just focusing on a domestic market. And unfortunately, outside of this brief kind of boom period, there doesn't seem to be a lot of effort to push Japanese horror films overseas right now. There is some, you can access some Japanese horror films on iTunes or other platforms with English subtitles. But Third Window Films has been really good about releasing a lot of films overseas, but it doesn't really seem to be happening, and I don't see it changing anytime soon, honestly. I hope for the benefit of everybody outside Japan that it moves forward. Netflix has actually been a real boon for that. Netflix has, afforded a lot of directors and creators opportunities that they would not have had with major studios. And then with Netflix produced content, you do have access to it in other countries. So if that continues, we might see more stuff that's available to international audiences.
Oh, good. So another question and then a comment, and I think then we'll be done. Amanda Weekly asks, I know that in many J-horror films, women are either the victims or the villains. Do you know any J-horror films where the male is the villain?
Sure. Yeah. I think actually, if we look at a lot of Kurosawa Kiyoshi's films, this is the case. A movie like Cure, which has this hypnotist serial killer who is a guy. And then the more recent Creepy as well, which has this, again, very creepy male protagonist who is the villain. So it certainly happens. I think that initially, in the late 90s and early 2000s, J-horror did get a lot of attention for its female vengeful spirits, just because this was something that, while it was quite common in Japanese literature and theater and film of the past 100 years, it was not something that a lot of people had seen in English language horror films. So they tended to focus on that because it was kind of different. So yeah, in films like The Ring and The Grudge, we do see mostly female villains and protagonists, but there are male ones. And as you said, in a lot of J-horror films, the women are still the victims. Men are too. It's a mix, but we do still have a lot of shrieking young women running from these female vengeful spirits as well.
So here, this is a comment from Patricia Yarrow, and it's in reference to the cutification discussion that you had just a few minutes ago. And Patricia notes that the cutified traffic cones at the Fukushima Daiichi plant that she visited last week was really startling. And in that case, the cuteness was actually horrifying.
Yep, I agree. I think there are certain instances where cute does not serve well. I have seen several examples. I think my favorite recent one was at the very beginning of the pandemic. Of course, Japan created a Corona mascot. And it was called, I think it was actually it was a quarantine mascot. So it was called Quara-chan.
Oh, that was a different one.
And it was just, like a blob with like a,
Actually,
and it was.
I'm doing this talk on Kauai in October, and so I have a lot of images of Fukushima mascots from groups urging people to go get cancer screening because of the radiation. So it isn't just the traffic cones. I mean, there's actual mascots in Fukushima that the civic groups are using to urge people to get cancer screening.
Yeah.
So I think we need to begin to wrap up. Rebecca, do you have any last, Copeland, do you have any last comments? And then we'll go back to Lindsay.
Okay. I just, thank you so much. And I think one last questioner was asking if the J-horror can extend beyond film to other media like literature. And I know that there are some creepy books. There's a horror genre for books, but is there a particular Japan horror genre?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something I haven't really put my toe in the water yet because there is so much. And I actually started with literature. A long time ago when I was a master's student, I was looking at Gothic literature in Japan. And yes, I mean, there's horror manga. People like Ito Junji, is incredibly famous for his very creepy manga featuring, scary drawings and stories. And there are horror games. I spent time reading research for my book, actually going to like obakeyashiki, haunted houses and scary themed attractions. So I was looking at a lot of other aspects of this. And yeah, a lot of untapped potential. I think that I didn't end up having time to cover much of it in the book, but there's so much more than film, for sure. I think Japan has a long history of having fun with scary things, whether that's, restaurants, live events, virtual reality theme parks, rides, just so much stuff. And that was a fun research period for sure, because I got to experience a lot of that.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Copeland, and thank you, Dr. Nelson. And so now that I've learned about the Scaredy Cat intervention, I kind of want that in my nightly news program.
I know.
But thank you for introducing me to that. And for the audience, this webinar is videotaped, and it will be on the UMSL Global YouTube channel. So if you have friends that want to look at it, you will be able to see it there. So thank you again, and thank you to the audience for the great questions.
Great question.
And yeah, it was really a wonderful talk. I learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Those were wonderful questions. It gave me a lot to think about. And thank you very much again to Dr. Miller and Dr. Copeland for organizing everything.
Okay, bye.